It's so important, as Professor Dhar said, it is so important for every university to have a women's study center. At my own university, the creation of the Women's Study Center had such an intellectual impact on the whole campus. Oh. Are we still there? Is everyone still there?
Yes, we're still here.
Okay,
Please don't present whoever's trying to do that. Let's not have any more disruptions.
Yeah, yes, sorry about that. Don't worry, everybody. You know, technology will not get us down. Feminists are much stronger than mere Google. But I just wanted to say how important it is to have a women's study center on your campus and on my campus. That it did several things that I think a lot of us were surprised at. It brought together faculty members who never talked about their work together. So, as you have done, sociologists and media professors and historians and sociologists and political scientists all of a sudden found that they had questions in common and that they learned from each other. Because it's surprising, but on many of our campuses, and I bet it's true on many of yours as well, we get what they call siloed, where you have separate streams. And the worst thing is they're separate streams of conversation. Well, none of us can really become smarter about this world. None of us can become deeper about this world if we silo our conversations. We need to have conversations, and I'm talking about students, graduate students, faculty. We need to have conversations together so that one of us can say, oh, I never thought of that. Or, oh, that kind of research approach would be great for me. I never tried it. Or that kind of questioning is new to me. What does it mean? So the JMI having a Women's Studies Center is so important and so valuable. And I hope it inspires all of you on all your campuses to really push for a Women's Studies Center that brings students and faculty together with new kinds of fresh questioning. So that makes me all the more pleased that Abhiruchi reached out and Dr. Dhar made it possible for us to all be together on this screen, despite Google's best efforts to try and turn us off. Never. So when I thought about what might be interesting to all of you and what I'm still exploring today, I thought it might be interesting for everybody, and of course we'll have a chance for conversation, to talk about what we've all learned about militarization. So let me talk about militarization for a minute and why I was slow myself to begin to ask not only questions about what is militarization, how does it happen in each of our lives, not just how does it happen in a country, how does it happen in our own families, our own lives, our own friendships, our own worries, our own aspirations, because all of those things can be militarized. Your aspirations can get militarized, your and my worries can get militarized, our friendships can get militarized. It really is a very deep and multi-threaded process, militarization. And when I first began to ask feminist questions, I'm very embarrassed to say I wrote a lot of books. Don't tell anybody. I wrote a lot of books when I didn't ask any feminist questions. So when I finally woke up and began to ask gender questions, and I'll tell you what is distinctive.
It's an ironic point where we lost her. when she first started to ask gender questions and we lost her. Yeah. I don't think the connection is going because on our end it is her net, which is not really stable. I think wherever she is.
I can see she has joined. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Don't worry. Well, listen, we are not going to be daunted by this, right? So let me.
This was like an answer to your when you first started to ask feminist questions, and then you were not there.
See, that's it. Whoever is running Google isn't happy with feminism, but we knew that already.
It's not a feminist, yes.
No, definitely not. Mr. Google is not a feminist, but we're stronger than Mr. Google. So let me just say that to ask gender questions, many of you know this, but let's just remind ourselves. To ask gender questions means that you're curious about masculinities, that's plural, all kinds of ideas about manliness, all kinds of contests about meanings about manliness, all kinds of rewards for certain kinds of manliness and punishments for others, right? That's really being interested in masculinities, plural. They're always plural. Some people will have you think that there's only one kind, but there's never just one kind of manliness. And then you're also, if you're interested in gender, you're interested and you're serious about the workings of femininities. And that means you're interested in, you're curious about, you research, you keep a close watch on the different ways of being a girl or the different ways of being a woman, and which ones are rewarded and which ones are controlled and which ones are punished. You're interested in plural of masculinities because masculinity is different than being male. Masculinity is all about meaning, not only in your own head, but in your mothers and your fathers and your uncles and your professors and your religious tutors. It's about meaning. And that's why it's so political. The meaning of various kinds of masculinities and who has a stake in which meanings, and the meanings of different kinds of being a girl and different kinds of being a woman, and who has a stake in suppressing some of those meanings and glorifying others. That's gender. And it took me a long time to realize that if I was going to understand politics in the world, the first country I ever studied, well, of course, the first country I tried to understand was the United States. That's hard enough. But the first country I actually traveled to and spent time in officially to try and understand was the country of Malaysia. But what I came to understand as I began to really explore masculinities and femininities in all kinds of spheres, in garment factories, in shipbuilding yards, in political parties, in militaries, of course, in police forces, in religious movements, was I needed to think about power. And that's what means, for me, asking feminist questions about gender. So when I say I try to teach about, write about, think about, explore feminist questions of gender, that's what I mean. I'm interested in all kinds of masculinities and the contests about them, all kinds of femininities and the contests about them. And as a feminist, I'm interested in the impacts of those contests on power. That's why I never say that I'm just a gender specialist, because I want to know the consequences for unequal power, usually unequal, for the workings of feminities and masculinities. So now, when I start thinking about militarization, I've got all those masculinities, femininities, and the workings of power in my mind. So let me just talk a bit about militarization, which some of you I think have studied, but we still all need to know more. We don't really know fully about how militarization works in our lives or in our country's lives. Militarization is a process. You'll see that I'm an optimist. So you'll see why it's important to me that militarization should be studied and observed and tracked as a step-by-step process. It doesn't all happen Tuesday morning at breakfast. It doesn't all happen in one fell swoop and is irreversible. It happens in small, sometimes big steps, but oftentimes small steps. And those steps do not necessarily go from 1 to 100 in a leap. And that means that if you're critical, and you'll see why I am, if you're critical of anything becoming militarized, that's hopeful, because it says that understanding that it's a process, it means it can move 2 or 3 steps along the spectrum and stop right there. It can go even 5 or 10 steps along the process, and I'll tell you what I mean by that, and be reversed. So one should not imagine that militarization is all or nothing. A lot of people who are invested in militarizing our lives, I'll tell you specifically what I mean by that. But the people who are invested in militarizing our lives, they think it'll make for a stronger society or a stronger family or a stronger individual character or more manly men or more womanly women. Those people would like us to imagine, I think, that militarization is a slippery slope that once you're on it, you can't stop. But that isn't true. We have so many experiences of entire countries that have rolled back militarization in their entire country's lives. I bet you all, or many of you, of the 90 of you that are here today, I bet many of you could name 2 countries that made the social decision, that is a countrywide decision, to give up their military. You think? Okay, you're thinking. I can see you thinking. Costa Rica in 1948. Costa Ricans, think about this. Costa Ricans, men and women, decided that they would no longer have a military because a military encouraged them to go to war with their neighbor El Salvador. And they used to have wars over soccer games. Not just fans, militaries. And so in 1948, Costa Rica, be a wonderful thing to study, Costa Ricans together made a decision that they would be a more secure country. Think about this. They would be a more secure country if they didn't have a military. And in fact, they haven't gone to war since 1948. The other country that decided not to have a military is Iceland. And Iceland made that decision when they became an independent country in 1944. They were under you never think of Denmark as a colonizer, but Denmark was a colonizer, and they colonized Iceland, and Iceland won their independence in the middle of World War II, and they decided as a new independent country that they would be safer if they didn't have a national military. So just think about that kind of thinking. Icelanders and Costa Ricans have very different cultures, have quite different experiences, different economies, and yet both sets of countries made the decision about security. And they decided that not having a military would make them more secure. Now, most countries in the world, including India and the United States, have not reached that level of thinking. And so we have very large militaries, both our countries. We have militaries that have a lot of influence in our societies. And that's a different kind of thinking. And it's more militarized thinking. So here's what it means to become militarized. It's to adopt, yes, it's about budgets. Yes, it's about armaments. Yes, it's about deploying our militaries to various border areas. But actually, I've learned over the years, especially since I've become a feminist, since I woke up and became a feminist and asked feminist questions. To become a feminist means you have feminist questions, not just feminist answers. And I've realized increasingly that militarization takes place in our thinking and in our feeling. So let me give you some ideas, and this doesn't mean from number 1 to number 100. This means amongst the ideas. And you can think about what of these ideas you have embraced. That's not judging yourself, it's just watching yourself. Or does your older brother have this idea whereas you don't? Or does your mother have this idea but your father doesn't? Right? One of the most profound ideas in militarization is that women need protection. That to be feminine, to be womanly, that is so that everyone approves of your femininity, means that you see yourself not only as needing protection, but now watch it, being grateful for protection. And the protection you're grateful for as a womanly woman is men's protection. In many families, if the father has died, the older son, who may just be 13, is looked to by the mother as the protector in the family. And a woman who's been widowed will even say to the young boy, you now are the man of the family. And part of being the man of the family, always in quotes, because the boy who's 13 may have an older sister who's 16, but she's not said that she's the protector of the family. The boy is. And that puts a responsibility for men as boys to see themselves as protectors. That's the masculinity of the protector. And it's the femininity of the protected. And I now really watch those ideas. I watch those expectations. I watch what that leads to. And it may not seem, it's not that somebody is going to have a gun and the other person isn't. It's the presumption that with masculinity, conventionally imagined, comes the responsibility of being a protector. And with femininity, again imagined, comes the responsibility to be grateful for men's protection. Now watch what protector and protected does in life. If you are a protector and you imagine yourself to be protector, or somebody pushes you to imagine yourself to be the protector. And remember, masculinity is about pressures from the outside, not just what you imagine yourself from the inside. That's why it's political. That's why it's sociological. If you imagine yourself to be a protector, or you are pushed to act like the protector, even though you don't want to be and you don't think you're good enough or proper enough or have the skills to be, you really think your older sister is much smarter. But you're being pushed to be the protector. Then one of the things that happens is that you imagine, and other people expect you to know about the larger world. You're supposed to know about politics. You're supposed to know about the community. You're supposed to know about decisions that are made and who makes decisions. Because as a protector, you're supposed to be worldly. You're supposed to know about the wider world, even if the wider world is simply your village or your neighborhood or your city, maybe. So you're supposed to be more political, because to be a protector means you're supposed to acquire and pretend you have knowledge about the wider world. You're the one who should read the newspaper. You're the one who should listen to the news programs, or at least claim you listen to the news programs, because you're the protector. So watch what happens. It means that if you masculinize the role of the protector, you also masculinize the notion of who is informed about the world and can claim to be informed about the world. That's your uncle who always at holiday dinners claims to know things. You're the protected. Now watch. This is how patriarchy works, folks. The protected is supposed to be feminized. Act like a woman. Act like a girl. And to be the protected means you're grateful to a male protector. Well, that already puts you in a subservient position. But even more risky, I think, that's me calling it a risk, is that the womanly protected person is not supposed to claim it that she knows about the world. As the protected person, she's supposed to be more domestic. She's supposed to be more local. She's not even supposed to be interested in the news. She's supposed to make meals and care for children. And even if she has paid work, she's not supposed to think it's the most important part of her life. Because then you're a woman careerist. And that's not very womanly in conventional terms. So the militarization of masculinity and the militarization of femininity, you'll notice, are different. That is, militarizing girls and women and military.
I think Professor
She's
is
back.
able to join. She's back.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, really.
Google knows every milestone.
How risky feminist ideas are, But thank you all for hanging in there. Sorry about being cut off and having to rejoin. But I just want to come back to this very elemental idea that is part of patriarchy and militarization. That is that men and boys are more naturally protectors. Now, this isn't true in life, Just think of all the girls and women you know who are the protectors of somebody, who gain knowledge so that they can be the protectors. So this is about myth. This is about expectation and pressure that boys and men will be the protectors and gain knowledge of the world so they can be protectors. Women and girls will be grateful and be more domestic in their aspirations. But what I want to make the point about is that militarization requires women and men to play different roles. Even if you have some women in the government's military, even if it doesn't really match realities as to who really protects who. The second thing is that they're interdependent, so they're different. That is, roles of conventional, approved, rewarded masculinity and roles of conventional, rewarded, approved femininity are different and they're interdependent, which is one of the things that makes a lot of patriarchal people, women and men, very nervous when women start taking martial arts, or when women say, I don't need your protection. I listen to the news. I know how the world works. I can protect myself. Or if I have protectors in some occasions, some of them will be women. And the third thing, besides difference and interdependence, is inequality. Because the presumption is that the person who's the protector will have more knowledge and more authority in the name of being a protector than will the girl and the woman who's supposed to be more local and more dependent. So militarization at its very heart, yes, it's about defense budgets. Yes, it's about buying and using fighter planes. Yes, it's about more men than women joining the state military. Yes, it's definitely about all those things. But at the core, it's about the presumed difference between women and men if they meet conventions. And if you start disrupting ideas about women's relationships to men, to imagine them as more autonomous from each other and yet more equally cooperative. Autonomous doesn't mean isolated. Autonomous means about a kind of equality that leads to more productive cooperation, not unequal interdependence, but real cooperation between equal humans. That really disrupts militarization. Now, some of the other ideas that go along with militarization, and you can watch them in all of your own lives. I watched them in my life. I certainly watched them in American society, but I watch them in other countries that I spend time working with and thinking about and trying to be useful to. I watch it in Turkey. I have Turkish feminist friends. I watch it in Sweden, where I have Swedish feminist friends. I watch it in Japan, where I have Japanese feminist friends. I watch militarization everywhere because I learn from everybody. So here are some of the ideas that become building blocks to move militarization kind of step by step along, but that can be reversed at any point that you start challenging these ideas or you start offering alternative ideas. One, that the world is a dangerous place. Now, it's not unreasonable to think in some settings, if you're a very impoverished person in New Delhi, daily life can feel very, very precarious. And for a woman or a man who's living a really impoverished life today in New Delhi, or today in my city of Boston, who doesn't have a regular home, for instance, that's not unreasonable. That's not crazy. That's not evil. But it is a building block. And there are alternatives to imagining that the world is a dangerous place. We can all start imagining that the world is a cooperative place, that people help out each other, that in fact, it's when people help out each other that life tends to get better. So the world is a dangerous place may seem like a reasonable idea that matches one's own reality, but it's not the only reasonable idea. A second idea, and that is that it is natural to have these people called enemies. That somebody will just say, well, yeah, everybody has enemies. Do you ever listen or watch or read police procedurals, that is, police mystery stories? And there's always the point where the detectives, the fictional detective, after there's been a murder, and the fictional detective comes and interviews the family or the workmates of the person in the story who's been killed. And the detective says, I've always noticed this, the detective says, well, did Mr. So-and-so have enemies? And I thought, what a strange question. I can't imagine anybody answering, oh yes, he had several, unless he's really a corrupt business person or a corrupt official or a really brutal officer. But otherwise, did he have enemies? And I always think that's strange, but there is a way of looking at the world that imagines that you are not a rational person if you don't imagine that the world is full of enemies. But the alternative is, it's unnatural to have enemies. What's natural is to have cooperative neighbors, cooperative people you don't even know, but that you depend on. That's how the global supply chain works. So the idea that it's natural to have enemies is also a building block or a bit of fuel that moves militarization of any of our lives or of social movements or of political parties or of whole countries further along, is to imagine that one has enemies. It's why in so many of our societies, and certainly including in the United States today, I'm very worried about anti-immigrant social movements. Because actually what I know is if it weren't for new immigrants, the United States would have a population problem. The reason so many cities operate today, including my city of Boston, certainly New York and San Francisco and Chicago, is there's so many new immigrants that are doing so many of the jobs that keep a city running every day. No immigrants, no social prosperity is what I see. But other people in other countries, not just the US, have made immigrants. People just wanting to make a better life into, quote, enemies. And that presumption that enemies are natural is very, very risky. And it justifies militarizing borders. It justifies militarizing police forces. It justifies militarizing courts to turn them into instruments for protecting us against so-called enemies. Another idea is that people who join militarized forces, sometimes the most militarized of the police units, because police are really varied, this is true of Indian police too, as to which units in a police are the most militarized, the most heavily weaponized. And usually, you could do a great study of this for your sociology course or your political science course or your gender course, of course. And that is to take one of your city's police forces and look at all the units within the police force and see which unit is the most heavily weaponized. And here's a radical guess that the more a unit in a local, same city now, more a unit in a local police force is weaponized, heavily weaponized, the more likely it is to be almost all male. Which means it's also a hierarchy of masculinity amongst the police that are on their bicycles and doing neighborhood policing, and people who are in their police armored vehicles with heavy weaponry. That's a hierarchy amongst the men themselves, but it's certainly a hierarchy amongst where more women are in the police and where more men are in the police. Another idea, and that is that soldiers, people in the government's military, are especially to be admired because they're acting as full citizens, citizens in the best sense in this conventional notion. And that glorifies soldiers, and because most militaries in the world have somewhere between 10 and 15% today. It differs by country. 10 or 15% women in uniform. So most militaries in the world today are at least 85% men. That makes the military one of the most masculinized of all public institutions. And that means you've got to have a feminist gender analysis of what goes on inside a military, but also what parents, fathers and mothers, and never lump them together, what fathers and mothers think when a son thinks about joining the military. What's the discussion like between the father and the mother about whether that's a good idea? Because the more admired a military is in any country, the more civic reward goes to the most masculinized institution. And that is never good for gender equity. Why aren't people working in rape crisis centers the most admired citizens? Seen as protectors, as creators of justice, of providing security and safety. What would happen if rape crisis volunteers and paid staff were highly admired in your country or mine? What if they led the parades? What if they were seen as the people who should hoist the national flag? What if they were the people who are held up as doing the most for the nation? Imagine what that would be like if rape crisis workers, men and women, were held up to be society's especially admired citizens. So the admiration that is oftentimes bestowed on the government soldiers in uniform is very, very, very unsettling, or an obstacle, I think, to public equity. Going along with this, and one of the reasons why soldiers are admired and why the world is thought a dangerous place is because social movements in both our countries and in many other countries, we are not alone, unfortunately, India and the US, in many countries, social movements, people running for office, political party platforms set up society as made up of us and them. And us and them divides people, but also makes people look as if they are each other's enemies. It makes the notion of belonging very narrow. Feeling that you belong is not a bad thing, but everyone should be able to feel as though they belong. Everybody. That's what makes all your universities so vital, is that you come on campus, you sign up for classes, or you are assigned to be a teacher, and you belong. Everybody belongs. That's how you make vibrant, secure, resilient societies. That's what feminists have learned in so many of our countries. Dividing people between us and them, which is an idea, it's not a reality. Dividing people between us and them shrinks civic life and endangers equity, which we all should be striving for. So I'll stop at this point, but you'll notice that every single one of these ideas has an alternative. None of these ideas is natural. And in fact, I never use the word natural. Natural, I put it in quotes. It's a made-up idea. It's ideas that are sold to us. And part of our work is to make sure that we show that it's a constructed idea and that there are alternatives to that and that ideas have consequences. And that's why the Women's Studies Center at JMI University is so valuable to all the disciplines on campus, to everybody's efforts to explore, to understand, to gain knowledge, is because feminist gender analysis really opens up our understanding of how society works and what are the consequences for men and consequences for women. And I don't have narrow definitions of those. Masculinities are plural, femininities are plural, and we as explorers want to listen to each other so we can better understand the world. Militarization always privileges not just masculinity. Militarization, the further down it goes, militarization privileges a narrow understanding of masculinity. Militarization rewards a narrow definition of the grateful, domesticated girl and woman. But we are not narrow. We are wide. And militarization cramps us and limits us and undermines genuine security. Thanks.
Thank you. That was provocative. You put a lot of questions there for us to think, and you're getting a lot of acknowledgement that, people really appreciated this. For people whose show of hands is there, please put your questions in the chat box. And I think you've touched on so many areas here, and the focus on masculinity in a way that it is equally discriminated in a sense, or an outcome of patriarchy as much as, other gender stereotypes are. And that is something that we have Kanchan Joshi who's asking here as well. In what ways can men and boys be engaged as allies in the fight for gender equality? And what strategies can be employed to challenge toxic masculinity and promote a positive form of masculinity? Because
I would say, to answer that question, of course, I don't have the answers to everything. I mean, we're all explorers together here, right? So I'm not the, answer person all by myself. But I'd say one thing is, and I mean this really seriously, boys and young men, and not so young men, should take gender studies courses and take women's history courses. Learn about Indian women's history. Learn about women's history internationally. Learn about where women are in the United Nations and why they're there and they're not everywhere. Take women's studies courses. I've had a number of university men take my women's studies courses. And several of them have said to me, they said a couple of things. One, they said, well, I decided, Professor Enloe, to take your course on women's studies because I so respect my mother. And my mother, I want to understand her life better. And I know this course won't be just about my mother, but I think if I take a women's studies course, maybe I'll more fully understand her life and be able to really appreciate all she does more. Then other young men have said to me, and they kind of whisper this, they come up after class and they say, you know why I'm taking this course? I say, no. They said, my girlfriend won't keep dating me if I don't take a women's studies course. and those things, they're not unreal, right? So I think one way to be a good ally, and ally, you're absolutely right, who asked this question. You're absolutely right to use the word ally, because ally is autonomous, thoughtful, explorative people trying to support each other. But it's really hard to support somebody if you can't understand their life, because otherwise you become a protector not an ally, right? I remember the first Take Back the Night March I ever went on. I'm sure there have been Take Back the Night marches in New Delhi sometime in the past.
Yeah, we had that as well.
Yes, right. They're wonderful. Yeah.
So we've created this notion of masculinity in the sense of perpetuation is perhaps of patriarchy is perhaps by women more than men. How would you react to that? And we've created this notion of masculinity and this expectation as well, and in both ways.
Yes. Well, I mean, every mother who wants her son to be manly, in some narrow sense of manly, every mother who worries because her son doesn't play sports, or every mother who worries that her son is not interested in learning how to fight, is perpetuating a narrow definition of masculinity. And it takes a lot of courage on the part of a woman who is a mother and does have sons to say to her women friends, my son is really interested in the arts. I'm so excited for him. I'm so interested. Or my son has been recruited by the military, but he's not going to do it. He doesn't want to do it. That's not the kind of life he wants. Or my son is really good at sports, but he loves to read. He's much more interested in reading. He's not going to go out for football. He's just rugby, cricket. He's not that interested in that. And that the mother with her women friends stands up for her son. And that can feel, or stand up to her mother, who's worried that her grandson is not becoming manly enough. That can take a kind of courage. And I really respect that. But it is absolutely true that, as you suggested, it's absolutely true that any patriarchal system, whether it be a law firm or a university or a family or a whole country, any patriarchal system that puts men and women in different positions that are interdependent and unequal, that's a patriarchy. Any patriarchal system will collapse if girls and women say no to it. And that's why so many patriarchal...
Or boys and men for that matter.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no.
They have to have the courage to be able to stand up to these stereotypical masculine...
It's very hard, which means that boys and men need allies too.
Absolutely.
They need allies from girlfriends and allies from girls who are friends and allies who are from women who are their workmates.
And there are other boys and men.
Absolutely. So everyone needs allies, because patriarchy depends on most of us being silent, being passive, being intimidated, being disinterested.
So when we take these workshops for adolescent boys, these boys will say, ma'am, we are happy to do any kind of work, sweep, swab, help our mother, I'm the only child. But we are not going to do this in front of our other friends. Because,
Yes.
That's this whole peer thing also which comes in, which
Absolutely. Yes, and this is true. There's a wonderful group that works particularly in African countries called Men Engage.
Yes.
And a lot of the work that they do very well. They're very, very Men Engaged. It's a very good group. And a lot of the work they do is with young men and boys so that they are not afraid of their friends.
So we had the first Men Engage International Conference was in Rio.
Oh.
And the second one was in Delhi, Habitat Center. We had a week-long workshop. Yes. And we had other genders come in there as well, which was great.
Excellent.
So it's something which is, catching on. And I would like to tell you that boys who have taken involuntarily, I suspect, because nobody would have pushed them to at the master's level stage, we have at least 30 to 40% boys in our MA Gender Studies program. So
it just shows you're attracting smart young men.
Absolutely. So we have a question from Professor Nadeem